This is a special online TLAC event. I'm the chair of the Great Lakes of Africa Center that's based at IOB. And so today we are joined by Professor Filip Reyntjens, one of the foremost scholars of African politics and law. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Antwerp, where his research has long focused on governance, law, and politics in Africa's Great Lakes region. And his latest book, Modern Rwanda, A Political History, traces 150 years of Rwandan history and also engages directly with the debates that continue to shape how we understand the country today. The rules of the game for this presentation are, as usual, Professor Reyntjens will first give his talk without being interrupted by any of us, but thereafter we open the floor for questions. And to ask a question, you can raise your hand or post a question in the chat box. You can find the chat box when you click on the purple arrow at the bottom right, and you can raise your hand when you click on this little guy or girl in the middle with the hand raised. And questions can be asked in French or in English. Of course, if you raise your hand, you wait until I give you the floor, and then you can also unmute your mic. Now, normally I would now all invite you to give a big round of applause, but since we're online, I just assume that you're clapping enthusiastically behind your muted microphones. Professor Reyntjens, it's an honor to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope I don't sound like Mickey Mouse, which was the case in before Hans intervened. This is interesting to see that our librarian is also a handyman, and they're all, or our support staff is multitasking, so that's great. Thank you for being here. We're going to discuss this one. It's my latest book, published early this year actually by Cambridge University Press. And it's a longue durée, 150-year history, political history of Rwanda, starting in the mid-19th century up to basically today, up to the moment the book was finished, and that's about 2 years ago. The Rwanda has been quite, I should say, heavily researched country, even before the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, but scholarship on Rwanda exploded after 1994, after the genocide, and indeed as a result of the genocide. One of the consequences of this entry into an already pretty well occupied research area or environment at the occasion of the genocide was, of course, that much of the history of Rwandan history was looked at through, or predominantly looked at through the lens of the genocide. This is something I and other, I would say, veteran scholars on Rwanda, like the Newberys, for instance, have tried to avoid. That's to avoid what is sometimes referred to as presentism. That is the hindsight that affects the reading of the country's history. Other scholars have referred to the tendency to write history backwards from present concerns. And that is what I try to avoid in this book. I wrote the book, I researched the book and wrote it as if the genocide did not occur. Before, of course, it occurred, when I addressed the 1990s, the civil war, and eventually the genocide. Of course, the genocide is there, is a historical fact. But what precedes 1990 has not been, at least in my reading of history, has not been included in my research. So I have done this research as if the genocide did not occur. And the genocide, by the way, was not inscribed as something inexorable, an inexorable event in the longue durée of Rwanda's history that genocide should not have occurred, and has occurred in particular circumstances that one can discuss. But I won't discuss today. I discuss it in the book and in another book that I published specifically on the genocide, which is Le génocide des Tutsi au Rwanda, which was published by the Presse Universitaire de France in their seizure collection. That is something I'm not going to address today. As can be seen elsewhere in the world as well, history writing in Rwanda is not merely about the past. It's also very much a contemporary political state, and it is even, and by all political sides involved, it isn't often exploited ideological tool. It's crucial critical junctures, such as, for instance, the 1959-61 revolution and the 1994 civil war and genocide. History has been produced by conflict parties in very different, even opposing fashions, as it suited their respective positions. And this is true for all parties involved in Rwandan conflicts, as it has been the case in conflicts elsewhere in the world. So the consequence of this has been that competing and political, or politicized, I should say, historical narratives have engendered a great deal of polarization in the political world, civil society, the media, and even in academia. And people in all those areas have been placed in camps, camps that were called pro or anti-RPF, pro or anti-Hutu, or pro or anti-Tutsi. So this is very much a polarized situation, and it was certainly very polarized in the years following 1994, but 31 years later it still is. I mean, it gives rise to a great deal of debate in academia, but also, for instance, on social media. Now let me address the major findings of the book, because I can of course not enter into any sort of detail. At first sight, it would look that three fundamental ruptures occurred in modern Rwandan history. Colonization, of course, starting in the late 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, which destroyed a centuries-old political and social and economic system and replaced it by something else that was extraneous to what would have been sort of natural developments in Rwanda had there not been this colonial intrusion. Then, of course, the revolution of 1959-61, that would probably not have taken place had there been no colonization, because the system would probably have adapted itself better to political demands that were formulated in a very aggressive fashion at the end of the 1950s, and of course the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, followed by the seizure of power by the RPF. Of course, these are major breaks, these three, and these are just recent breaks. I mean, just the last 100 years of Rwandan history, which is a very brief period, or rather brief period. These are ruptures, of course, major breaks. But there are also, and this has been one of the things that struck me during this research, there are also striking continuities spanning the entire period from the mid-19th century to the 2020s. And I'll first address a number of continuities. The first continuity, and I should start by saying that the history of modern Rwanda has been marked by continuity more than it has been marked by change. An obvious continuity throughout the four periods being pre-colonial, colonial, the first two republics, sometimes referred to as the Hutu republics, and the post-1994 period. During those four periods, what is an obvious continuity is a concentration of power. The pre-colonial kingdom became increasingly centralized, particularly from the latter part of the 18th century, the areas under central court control, many parts of what we call Rwanda today were not controlled by the central court. Actually, Rwanda in 1900 was actually smaller than it is today, contrary to what is often said. But in the part that was controlled by the royal court, the areas under control were embedded in a pyramid-like structure where regional authorities were dependents of the Mwami, the king, and below them were the chiefs who represented them. Authoritarian centralization continued during colonial days in two ways. On the one hand, indirect rule, meaning ruling through what was then referred to as indigenous authorities like the king, the court, and the chiefs. Indirect rule reinforced and stabilized the power of the court and the kings, at least initially. And on the other, the Belgian colonial administration was itself, of course, authoritarian and ignored such principles as a separation of powers and rule of law. So it's not surprising that in Rwanda, like elsewhere in Africa, the political elites that inherited the state after independence practiced business as usual and continued colonial modes of governance. So the pre- and post-genocide regimes have fundamentally shared the same authoritarian concern with power and control. And both leaderships have claimed, and I'm talking about, I would particularly compare the Habyarimana regime between 73 and 90 or 94 and the current regime. Both leaderships have claimed to be best able and willing to guide the country along the right path of peace, security, unity, and development. And this is sort of words you hear in speeches in both pre- and post-genocide regimes. A second continuity is intra-regime conflict. The authoritarian nature of these successive regimes might suggest that they were monolithic, but they were not. Internal strife within the royal court and among ruling elites was common in pre-colonial days, and most successions to the throne or to the drum, if you want, were contested and led to bitter and often violent infighting and even to civil war. And internal struggles actually within the court and the aristocracy continued well during the first years of German rule. And it is actually because the Germans imposed law and order in a very radical and violent way that they prevented King Musinga's overthrow. From Rwandans know, of course, that Musinga came to power as a result of a coup d'etat in 1896, again illustrating how internal strife existed in the court. The pacification of the country by the Germans and the ending of an incipient civil war against King Musinga, which was only achieved in 1912. And of course, during the entire reign of Musinga, until he was removed by the Belgians in 1931, factions at the court continued jostling for power, influence and wealth. This is all very well documented, particularly by the research of Alison Defoe. Regime infighting continued after independence, and I'm watching the time now because I've got to avoid going into any detail. Let me just show that after independence, the gradual narrowing of the ruling party of the time, the NDR Pamehutu power base, eventually led to the downfall of the First Republic. And a similar phenomenon of narrowing of political base occurred during the Second Republic. The North took power in 1973 under General Habyarimana, but the prefectures of Gisenyi and Ruwenzori soon fell out with each other, and there was even later a split between the Bushiru and the Bugoyi within Gisenyi region. So from a I would say, generally speaking, Hutu dominated, the system became very much a northern and particularly Bushiru-dominated political system. And the RPF too has fallen prey to intense struggle. Much of the infighting is largely invisible to outsiders, as the debates on major issues take place within a small inner circle, but on a number of occasions, when leading figures of the RPF fell out, left the country, and engaged in diaspora opposition activities, these splits have become quite apparent. And that is still the case today. So that's the second continuity, infighting, regime infighting. The third element, and here I'm going to make a distinction, the theme is the same, but there is a great distinction I'll make in a moment, so I'll point at continuity in the issue of ethnicity now, but I will also show in a moment that there were fundamental breaks there as well. Predominantly ethnic reading of Rwanda's history skews historical understanding, and it's an error to concentrate too much or just concentrate on ethnic divisions. But there is no way in escaping the fact that the third major continuity is the salience of ethnicity. Political ethnicity emerged in the 19th century. Before colonial days, the distinction between ethnic groups became institutionalized, and particularly with the introduction of Uburetwa, a corvée in terms of labor to be done for chiefs, but also the giving to chiefs or political authorities of agricultural produce. That was introduced, as I said, around 1870, Uburetwa, and that was imposed only on Hutu. So two hierarchical social categories thus came into being. And it's interesting because I imagine this will, what I say here, because this is contrary to the regime's narrative that ethnicity did not exist before colonial days, and that it was a creation of colonial rule in order to rule to divide by dividing. It's interesting to say that the official history written by a group of Rwandan scholars under the auspices of the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, a book called History of Rwanda, I quote them: King Rwabugiri imposed Uburetwa on the Abahutu in order to punish them for their responsibility in his defeat in Kore. So that is a position even held by those who have organized, so to speak, scientifically the official historical narrative. And there were several revolts in the 1870s up to the 1890s, even before the first Europeans set foot in Rwanda. And of course, colonial rule further institutionalized and rigidified ethnicity, inspired by the so-called Hamitic hypothesis, which is a very Eurocentric hypothesis, claiming that Tutsi and other groups in the region, like Hima or Hema in Ituri, simply because they looked more like Europeans, had a right to rule and were sort of our cousins, based on, or inspired by the Hamitic hypothesis. Belgium entrenched Tutsi rule and institutionalized ethnicity, including through ethnic mentions on identity cards in the 1930s and ethnic census. And the revolution of 59-61, although there were also social and political and even economic concerns, took place under an almost exclusively ethnic banner. And of course, Hutu elites dominated the first two republics, under which an overt ethnic narrative, Rwanda Nyamwishi, the majoritarian people narrative, and practice such as a quota system prevailed. And upon assuming power in 1994, the RPF set out to pursue a policy of de-ethnicization, but the denial of ethnicity is an essential element of the hegemonic strategies of the elite currently in place. Ethnic amnesia, the notion that there are no longer Hutu, Tutsi and Twa, but only Rwandans, this ethnic amnesia hides ethnocracy just like it did in Burundi in the 70s and 80s. A final strong continuity lies in the nature of the state, which is, unlike in much of Africa, is strong, well internalized by citizens. Rwanda is not a colonial creation, and an old state tradition plays an undeniable role in the maintenance of an efficient pyramid-like political and administrative structure, and that is remarkably well to be seen after what happened in 1994, the utter destruction of Rwanda. A mere 2 years later, Rwanda was completely reconstructed, an administration was in place, judicial system, taxes were raised and spent, and the country, I would say, was also, was again, because that was also the case before 1994, the country was again run in an efficient fashion. Total control over state and society was established by the RPF after 1994, just as it was under Habyarimana before 1994. I'm watching my watch. Change, I've just discussed 4 elements of continuity over this 150-year period. There are also changes or breaks that occurred in important respects. The discontinuities can be most prominently seen in 2 areas, and I will discuss them briefly. The dominant role of the military, both as an institution and a source of ethics, that is one. And again, returning to an issue I raised a moment ago, diverging approaches to the issue of ethnicity. Let's take the military institution first. In pre-colonial, the military institution was central to state structure. Rwanda was one of the very few, and perhaps the only, kingdom in the region, in the Great Lakes region, where the army was organized in such a professional fashion, and where permanent armies were deployed, particularly, of course, in periods of conflict with regional competitors. And Rwanda has been under Rwabugiri, for instance, because there it is particularly well documented, has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years. So this, during Rwabugiri, between, say, the mid-1850s and the mid-1890s, has been almost constantly at war, with both inside the country to control rebellions, to try and take control of outlying areas, but also with neighbors, particularly in the west and in the north. And the recruitment of young Intore fighters were strong instruments to spread these values across the entire elite and to promote the glorification of a warrior ethos. The saying goes, and still goes, I'm told that Kagame still reminds that to his generals and his military superior officers, Rwanda ruratera, ni ruterwa, meaning Rwanda attacks, Rwanda is not attacked, which is a strong token of a belief in military might and the importance of having a strong military, which can still be seen today, of course, in Rwanda's deployment in DRC, of course, but also in Mozambique and the Central African Republic. The centrality of the army and its values disappeared for a full century during colonial days, because then, of course, the Pax Germanica, Pax Belgica prevailed. But even under the First Republic, definitely was a civilian republic, but even under the Second Republic, which was the fruit of a military coup d'etat, civilians very soon took over the reins of power, although Habyarimana, of course, was a military and he remained president until he was shot out of the air on the 6th of April 1994. There were, as I said, no references to the military institution or warrior values during the two republics, during the two Hutu republics, I should say. The ideological reference there was rather that of the hard-working peasant. So in the ideology of rural romanticism, only the Hutu were the real peasants, while the Tutsi belonged to a feudal class. In other words, the army was not predominant, and the Rwandan army was actually a very small army during the first two republics, and has never been operating abroad, and has never actually been engaged in fighting with any neighbors. Militarization returned almost overnight under RPF rule, and the continuity with the colonial era was explicitly affirmed. Both the army as an institution and military values have been actively promoted since the RPF took power. This shows, for instance, in the fact that the army and intelligence services became the pillar of the regime, just as the armies were in pre-colonial days. Beyond the institutional aspect, military ethos and values permeate the entire Rwandan society. Again, with reference to the pre-colonial past, Ingando re-education camps and Itorero training of Itore, disseminate military values, and militarization has effect beyond, as I just said, Rwanda's borders, which can be seen by the regime's behavior throughout the region. So that's one, the importance of the military institution and military ethos. The second is the issue of the salience of ethnicity. As I said, it can be seen throughout the four periods. The role, although it can be seen throughout the four periods, the role played by ethnicity and use made of it are another break. The awareness, as I said, of distinction between Hutu and Tutsi spread during the second half of the 19th century. Functions in the court and the chiefly apparatus were reserved for Tutsi, and only Hutu, as I said a moment ago, were subjected to uburetwa. But ethnicity, as I have again pointed out, was made explicit and further institutionalized by the Belgian administration, whose support for the Tutsi hierarchy, indirect rule, remember, ended only in the late 1950s in a pre-revolutionary context. It has become important then, in the 1950s, as it has become important today for Tutsi elites to stress the centuries-old national unity and to deny the reality of ethnic discrimination. In opposition, the ethnic card was explicitly played in the First and Second Republic. And as I earlier said, the reading of history gave rise to the claim that Rwanda was the land of the Hutu, and to the conflation of democracy with Hutu rule. Just as the Hutu had been before the revolution, the Tutsi were the victims of discrimination, under the first two republics, and even of genocidal violence, particularly at the end of 1963, and of course again in 1994. Many of the Tutsi fled the country, and by the end of the 1980s, so well before the 1994 genocide, over 500,000 Tutsi lived in exile. I need to move forward because we need to have some time for discussion. As I said earlier, the ethnic amnesia, the non-recognition of the reality of ethnic belongings, serves to hide the reality of Tutsi ethnocracy, just like actually the insistence on the majority people served to hide the ruling by a small Hutu, because those were small groups, a Hutu majority before 1994. The continuities of this longue durée outweigh the ruptures. Rwanda was and is today a violent society. Wars with neighboring countries and unruly regions were frequent, as were violent confrontations within ruling elites during pre-colonial days. The tradition to a strong state dates back to Mwami Rujugira, almost 250 years ago, and continues up to the present day. And as I said, in apparent contrast to the monolithic image, intra-regime elite conflict is considerable. It's interesting to note that since the late 18th century, that was Rujugira's reign, since the late 18th century, not a single head of state in Rwanda has been succeeded in a constitutional and peaceful fashion. All have disappeared as a consequence of coup d'etat or of murder. And the salience of ethnicity has been and remains another defining factor. Simply put, under Tutsi rule, and I say Tutsi between inverted commas, because of course most Tutsi do not take part in the exercise of power. These are Tutsi elites, just as there were Hutu elites before 1994. Ethnic amnesia is used to hide ethnocracy by Tutsi elites, while under Hutu rule, ethnic belonging was highlighted to justify ethnocracy by Hutu elites. In both cases, this practice has been and is used to relegate the other group to a subordinate status. I should add, before ending, that these are elite policies, as I said before. Throughout the entire period I study in the book, the gap between the elites and the people has been and remains wide. And it's actually quite interesting to read the RPF's daily paper, the New Times. When you read the New Times, this could be a paper published in any European country. It expresses concerns and interests and activities of urban elites who live just like Europeans do. And the distance between what the New Times reports basically on what happens in Kigali, because that's what the New Times reports on, the gap between those activities and reports in the New Times and what happens on those 1,000 hills outside Rwanda is nowhere to be seen, and will not be seen, by the way, by the people going to Rwanda next weekend for the World Cycling Championship. So this is a matter of a gap between elites and the people. It has been and remains wide, just as like the court and chiefly structure was disconnected from daily lives of the vast majority of Rwandans in pre-colonial days. The RPF's leadership's urban and cosmopolitan lifestyle is miles apart from that of ordinary citizens, both Hutu and Tutsi. In today's Rwanda, and this will be my final observation, in today's Rwanda, constant references to history, whether factually true or not, are used as a tool of legitimation. The idealized glorification of the pre-colonial era supports the political objectives and strategies of the current rulers. Therefore, the longue durée is not just a historical and epistemological issue, but very much a concrete contemporary political stake. Hence the efforts of the RPF to impose and tightly police its narrative. The problem is that, and this has been borne out by a great deal of fieldwork research, although that has tended to decrease over the last, I would say, almost 10 years now. But the problem is that, as is borne out by that research, the problem is that the public and the hidden transcripts often do not tally. History in Rwanda is considered a dangerous subject by most ordinary Rwandans, and in a political context where the hidden transcript cannot be publicly expressed, alternative narratives encode subtle resistance to the official history. So that's my brief introduction. I'm very interested in reactions that you or comments that you have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Filip, for keeping your own time so that we still have ample of time for discussion. So as I said before, you can either raise your hand and then I will give you the floor and you unmute your mic, or you can post your question in the chat box by clicking on the right arrow and then just typing it. And I repeat that you can ask your questions in French or in English. It's always difficult to be the first one, certainly when it's a full online event. But somebody needs to start. And otherwise I will, of course.
I was just going to say, Marijke, that it's very pleasant to hear that everyone seems to agree.
Apparently, yeah. I thought it was a controversial topic, Rwandan history and politics, but apparently everyone agrees. No, I have a question, Filip. I will start and then maybe I will inspire the others. I see Mark is already waiting then in line to go second. So you mentioned this ethnic amnesia, Filip, and of course I agree that it primarily serves to hide an ethnocracy. So the dominance of a small Tutsi elite in politics. Do you think that over time, across multiple generations, it can also have a positive effect, even though that may be unintended initially? In the sense that instead of the ethnic identity, Rwandans will put first the Rwandan identity. It's a kind of a forced amnesia, I know, but if it's sustained across many generations, could it have an unintended positive effect?
Could well be the case, but we don't know today what will happen in a couple of generations. All I can see is what I see now. I've done a research, pretty limited research, a couple of years ago, identifying ethnically. We're talking about minority ethnocracies here, right? Which you find not just in Rwanda or until sort of 20 years ago in Burundi, but which you find in other countries as well. And one of the things I've done there was to try, and this turned out to be easier than I feared, to try and identify ethnically 200, it was about 200, I think 199, of the most important functions in Rwanda in politics, but also in the economic sector, the media, churches, I mean, so 200 most important Rwandans. And what I found out, and this was, by the way, not contested, because the data set was made available, I found out that 80% of those functions were occupied by Tutsi, in a country where Tutsi represents less than 20%. Now, surely, of course, there is no Hutu movement, as there was in the late 1950s, contesting this situation, because those who do end up in jail or in exile or are killed or disappeared. Someone who has, in a pretty moderate fashion, denounced this is Victoire Ingabire. I'm not an Ingabire supporter, but she's in jail again, you know, because she has been speaking out and has been discussing with friends of her and maybe party members, although her party is not recognized and doesn't really exist, I feel. Discussed a book, a rather ironic book, about how you can peacefully overthrow dictatorships. and she's again in jail for that. So I mean, what I'm meaning to say is here that first of all, people in Rwanda, most people in Rwanda, do not express their views on this. Of course, the Rwandans in Hutu Rwandans, and not just, I think, elite Hutu Rwandans. I think many people realize that because, well, one of those the areas I studied in the research I was referring to were also local mayors. The vast majority of local mayors and local authorities are Tutsi. So that means that even those rural Hutu, who are peasants, who have no political ambitions, are faced every day with what they see, or some of them at least see, as a return to the pre-revolutionary situation. Now, one can hope, and I would hope that you're right, that a longer period of living together with an official insistence on the irrelevance of ethnicity might lead, in a couple of generations, to a Rwanda where ethnicity is irrelevant and where citizenship is important, politically speaking. French term citoyenneté expresses it better. You know, there's the link between the population and the state. People relate to the state, and citoyenneté or citizenship should be based on ideas, not, of course, on ascriptive criteria like ethnicity. But that being said, there is no indication today, I agree with you that there is no public, visible, should I say, contestation of the current ethnocratic political dispensation. That is clear. But it's also an extremely repressive regime that is present everywhere. I mean, you have local authorities, but you also have, and there again, there's some field research that shows that. There's also intelligence and military presence everywhere in Rwanda, including on the most remote hills, so people know they are under surveillance, if I may say so. And so, Marijke, I'm afraid we don't know what the feeling of all those people is, but it's certainly the experience is that minority ethnocracies tend to, they may well be more resilient than majority ethnocracies, because they have to develop all sorts of mechanisms to protect themselves from being overthrown. But minority ethnocracies are not eternal, and when you speak in terms of generations, we're speaking, I don't know, 60, 70 years from now, I think it's impossible to know what Rwanda will look like, even in 10 years' time.
Okay, thanks, Filip. Either it's my naive question or your elaborate answer that inspired participants to ask questions, but in the meantime, we have 4 questions. I will give the floor to Mark and Filip Reyntjens in that order, and I propose to pool those questions so that we can be efficient. And please present yourself before you take the floor, and then I will look also at the chat, Filip, where I already see 3 questions. I will study these and then summarize them, so you can pool all of these questions if feasible. Mark, you have the floor.
Yeah, this is Mark Boland. I'm an economist I've been looking at African markets, African countries for about 15 years' time. So my question...
Can you speak out louder, please? I hardly hear you.
Okay, I'll try to do that. I don't have a microphone. So my question is, I mean, it's a very interesting paper. My question is perhaps a little bit outside of the paper. I hope you don't mind. So it is, of course, Rwanda has one of the highest population densities in the world, together with Burundi. And you could argue that now, with a drop in infant mortality, that's been lower, and you still have the majority of the population is still in the agricultural sector. And of course, we know with diminishing economies of scale, it's very harder and harder to make a living in agriculture with so little land being available. And I'm just thinking, well, my observation is that now that's this kind of involvement in the Eastern Congo, they now seem to be setting up an administration there, and I guess primarily initially it's to kind of draw in more of the mineral resources to be a conduit, you know, channeled through Rwanda and then to Dubai. But it's just any kind of reflection on how the regime has handled this high population density land question historically, with parallels to what we're seeing now, especially in the Eastern DRC. That would be great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I now give the floor to Filip Reyntjens. Yes, Filip, go ahead. We are not yet hearing you.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
No, Filip Reyntjens, not Reyntjens. Yes, Filip Reyntjens.
Yeah, okay, yes. Yes, Filip.
Okay, he's not available right now. So I'm going to summarize, Filip, the questions that I found on the chat box. So Johan Swinen, who I think does not need an introduction to this audience, asks whether your book also deals with the historical geographic dimension of Rwanda, so the claims of the restoration of the Hima Imperium. And then we have a...
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of your sentence.
The claims of the restoration of the Hima Imperium.
Ah, okay.
And then we have a question by Victor, who asks whether you see any hope of addressing issues that have always pushed Rwanda backwards in terms of reconciliation and inclusive development. So whether besides the gloomy picture that we may see, there is also a story or an avenue of hope. And then maybe the comment or question by Paul Lambers goes into that direction. He states that the economic development currently seems to benefit, let's say, a majority of Rwandans, both rural and urban, even though it benefits some more than others. But since the majority also stands to benefit, could that steady development towards a medium-income African country may contribute to the mitigation of ethnic tensions? And maybe we stop here, and then the other questions will be for the next round.
All right. The point or points raised by Mark are, of course, extremely important. I would say they're existential. This is about the possibility to feed your population in a country that has a mainly, not exclusively, but mainly an agricultural sector. And some of it is actually still today subsistence agriculture. It's an interesting question, including because this has been raised, this issue of population density has been raised, you won't believe it, but has been raised at the end of the 1940s, when Belgium drafted a 10-year plan for the economic, social, and even in those days political development of Rwanda-Urundi. And at the end of the 1940s, the population density, overpopulation, was identified as a huge problem that needed to be addressed urgently. In those days, the population of Rwanda was 1.5 million. It is now 10 times, or almost 10 times that. And they still seem to be alive, which is, in a sense, quite astonishing, because at the end of the 1940s, it was announced that this was absolutely untenable, that something needed to be done about this, etc. Let me, because that question came up too later, No, but also by Mark actually, the Eastern Congo thing as some sort of a reservoir to accommodate the surplus of Rwandans. This is in a sense a very old idea. In the 1930s already and 40s and even early 50s, there was a mission d'émigration des Banyarwanda under Belgian colonial rule, where Rwandans were exported in those days, mainly Hutu, were exported to the Kivu region, to Eastern Congo, to working mainly on agricultural plantations and things like that. But the idea was already then, there is an overpopulation and we must use the Congo, which was supposedly and in a sense compared to Rwanda underpopulated. We need those people to develop agriculture and also mining. Many were actually sent to Katanga as well to work in the mines. So the idea to export populations is the idea that Rwanda is overpopulated is very old. And the idea that you need to export populations is old as well. I would like to remind you that in the, I think it was in the 1970s or early 1980s, the Habyarimana regime, for the same reason, exported Rwandans, 50,000 of them, if my memory serves me well, 50,000 of them to Gabon, which is indeed an underpopulated country. And those Rwandans were sent there because they were good farmers and they would make a living and they would also ease the demographic burden in Rwanda. According to what I learned in those days, most of those Rwandans actually returned to Rwanda and they returned by foot. Rwandans can walk very long distances. They have shown that in 96, 97, when they fled the advancing RPF in what was then Zaire. So yes, the position of the Rwandan government makes a great deal of sense, of course, in terms of what you need to develop. Well, you obviously don't need to develop subsistence agriculture. You need to develop, which is something Rwanda does in a very ambitious way and with a great deal of vision, for instance, the tourism sector, or MICE, meetings, incentives, conferences, and events. The World Cycling Championship is part of that. It's creating an image of Rwanda where people want to go to. The development of the national airline, Rwandair, the building of the new Bugesera airport, all those things belong to a coherent, ambitious plan to make Rwanda into essentially a services-oriented country, as it is landlocked and doesn't have that much natural resources, as has been reminded. Also, I think by Mark, is that that most of the minerals, and including gold, exported by Rwanda and, by the way, by Uganda, come from the Congo and are illegally smuggled into Rwanda and then find their way into the world market. So I agree with the suggestions made by Mark. Someone asked about the Hima Empire. There is no such thing as the Hima Empire. Actually, the Hima don't even exist except in Uganda. They're an ethnic group in Ankole, or Ankore, as the kingdom was called before colonial days. So there you have Hima and Bairu, just like you have Tutsi and Hutu in Rwanda, and just like you have Hema, sounds a bit like Hima, and Lendu in Ituri, for instance. So this is a pretty common thing, but there has never been a Hima empire. Quite to the contrary, Rwanda dominated by what's in the Hamitic hypothesis, which is an absolutely fake hypothesis, by the way, that the Tutsi, because they looked like Europeans. Let me give you one example to show how this played out. I mean, one colonial guy said about the Tutsi, Du nègre, ils n'ont que la couleur. They only have the color of the black man, but they're actually whites under a black skin. Or, avant d'être nigritisés, ces hommes étaient bronzés. Before becoming black, they were tanned. So they were actually Europeans or perhaps Egyptians. This is historically, there's historically no basis for that at all. And historically speaking, there has never been a Hema empire. As I said, quite contrary, the Rwandan kingdom, dominated by Tutsi, that you would then in that ideology call Hema, actually fought many wars with neighboring kingdoms that were also dominated by Hema, for instance, or Hema, not Hema. There was no fight, I think, with Ituri, which was no kingdom, by the way. But there were, for instance, wars with almost all neighboring countries, like Nyabungo, with the Bashi or Bushi. With Burundi, many wars, and there again, I mean, the kingdom was dominated by Tutsi. So, I mean, there was never a Hema empire. To the contrary, those who are called Hema in that fake ideology were actually the adversaries or the enemies of the Rwandan kingdom. So Hema were fighting Hema, so to speak. I know that the idea of the Hema empire is ideologically present, for instance, in the DRC, when, for instance, Rwandan leaders historically wrongly claimed that the Rwandan kingdom was much larger in pre-colonial days, that it encompassed parts of what is currently the DRC and large parts actually of Uganda. I would be more worried if I were Museveni than if I were Tshisekedi. The idea that the claims that Rwanda, the large Rwanda, the big Rwanda, that this is a return to the Hema empire is an ideological proposition. But I understandable from, for instance, a Congolese or a Ugandan point of view, because Rwandan regime spokespeople, in the past, they don't do it that often these days, but in the past, I remember Pasteur Bizimungu, when he was still president at the end of the 1990s, showed a map with the Greater Rwanda, and that contained large parts of the DRC and Uganda. So that's the idea of the Hema empire, but that's ideological, although understandable from a Congolese point of view. And again, today, of course, because the fear, which in Congo is an old fear of Balkanization, that Eastern Congo would de facto or even de jure become part of a greater Rwanda, is a fear that is concretely lived in the Congo, and I understand why they fear that. And as things seem to be developing today in Eastern Congo with the AFC M23 putting in place its own administration, its own political structures, a banking system, etc. With the Rwandan army, the Rwanda Defense Force present in the Congo, I can understand these concerns, and the Washington Agreement of the end of June is not going to solve that problem. One of the things that will need to happen is to make sure, as happened in 2012, 2013, that Rwanda is made to halt its support for M23. I say that because the whole idea of Hema empire originates from the fear that Rwanda nurtures imperialist views on parts of the DRC, which it indeed politically and economically and militarily considers as its backyard. Let's see what else. Yes, economic development. There are basically two Rwandas. You know, there's the good bureaucratic, technocratic governance in Rwanda. I refer to the rebuilding of the state in no time. this is a real state. It's unlike the DRC, for instance, which empirically speaking doesn't perform minimal state functions. In Rwanda, what we have is real state. We have a regime with vision and ambition, as I said, which does things and get things done. Not always successfully. Very often you find huge ambitions expressed, and then when you check a couple of years later whether they came into effect, the answer is often, I should say, no. But still, I mean, it is certainly a performing system. So, in other words, in terms of bureaucratic, technocratic governance, this is simply one of the better African states, no doubt about it. The problem, of course, with Rwanda is its political governance, for reasons that I expressed a moment ago. Now, in terms of economic development, the official growth figures are important. I mean, 7–8% a year, almost year after year. The problem that I see with these figures is dual. First of all, in terms of GDP per capita, Rwanda remains about the 20th poorest country in the world, and has been that for many years, before 1994, but has remained so since the RPF took power. And I don't see Rwanda moving on this sort of hit parade of GDP per capita. And at the same time, and this would show that although the GDP obviously grows, that the Gini index of inequality in Rwanda is very high and has a tendency of rising. Is among, not the highest, South Africa is higher, but is among the highest in Africa. So this shows that growth benefits a particular part of the population, which I identified during my presentation as the population that reads the New Times in Kigali, and that goes to basic fit places, to all sorts of nightclubs, to sports events, to dress, that lives a life that is cosmopolitan, modern, and quite affluent life. But you cannot have a GDP per capita that is stagnant in terms of world ranking, and a high Gini index on the one hand, and attempts to increase equality between citizens, which, by the way, it may be in the future, coming back to Marijke's initial question, what will happen in a couple of generations. Ethnicity may well not become the most important aspect, but inequality may become the most important aspect. For most Rwandans, let's not forget, 14 million Rwandans on a territory that is smaller than Belgium. This is absolutely astonishing. Burundi comes second in line in continental Africa, but Rwanda and Burundi have the highest population densities in the whole of continental Africa, I should say, because Mauritius, I think, has even a higher population density. This is going to be the major challenge for the country, whoever is in power. I mean, whether it's Kagame or Habyarimana, the challenges are exactly the same. Those are, I think, more or less the 4 questions that I noted.
Thank you, Filip. Indeed, there is a batch of new questions ready already, so I'm going to give the floor to Filip Reyntjens, and after Filip, I will summarize the questions that in the meantime appeared on the chat. Filip, I hope your audio issues solved in the meantime. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Marijke. Thank you, Filip. Greetings from IPI's Research Institute around the corner. We had a small group stream here, so several people attending. Thanks a lot. Here with me is one of our interns, Rodrigue, a citizen from Congo, from South Kivu, and Rodrigue would like to ask a question. I give him the floor.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello, Rodrigue.
Yeah. My name is Rodrigue Dieu merci Chiweru. From DRC Congo. I finished already my master's degree at Antwerp University. Now I'm doing an internship here at IPIS. But I could want to ask my question in French to be understandable very well. If you allow, I can ask the question.
Yeah, sure, Rodrigue. Vas-y en français.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Ma question tourne autour de la complexité de l'ethnisation au niveau justement de Grands Lacs, principalement en RDC, à l'est de la RDC, où justement nous avons observé pendant un temps, parce que c'est déjà d'ailleurs un article publié, lorsqu'il y a des manifestations, je rentre un tout petit peu en arrière, des génocodes qu'on a essayé un peu de commémorer en août, chaque août de l'année, nous avons constaté avec regret que les groupes Banyamulenge ne participent pas à ce genre de manifestations. Bien lors que quand le 1-23 était justement au niveau de la partie territoire de Massissi, tous les Bashi, tous les Barega, toutes les autres ethnies à l'est de la RDC ont essayé un tout petit peu justement de manifester, mais aussi c'est aussi de Burundi. Malheureusement, la partie Banyamulenge n'avait pas justement rehaussé leur voix. Et après, on s'est demandé la question de savoir, faut-il croire que la guerre de 1-23, derrière elle, il y a justement l'ethnisation ou justement l'exploitation des ressources naturelles? Ça, c'est une question qui a été justement soulevée après un constat malheureux que justement les gens de la RDC, principalement du Nord et du Sud Kivu, ont constaté lors de certaines manifestations. Merci.
Oui, c'est une question qui est qui demande, qui sollicite des hypothèses et qui évidemment est fort liée à la situation actuelle à l'Est. Je vais d'abord dire un mot sur, oui, je voudrais d'abord dire à l'attention de Filip Reyntjens et des amis de IPIS qu'on est vraiment voisins, hein, on ne peut pas être plus voisins que ça. On habite l'un derrière l'autre, derrière le coin, et qu'on a eu par le passé, peut-être trop peu aujourd'hui, beaucoup de coopération entre l'IOB et IPIS. Sur la question de Rodrigue, d'abord je voudrais dire un mot sur la notion de holocauste, génocide. C'est une notion que je n'aime pas, parce qu'elle suggère que aujourd'hui un génocide a lieu, notamment comme suite de l'exploitation, de la lutte pour l'exploitation de matières premières. Je ne pense pas que le Congo a besoin, et là je vais être un peu militant, je ne pense pas que le Congo a besoin de cette notion de génocide. Les crimes commis, et pas seulement, il faut insister, pas seulement par l'armée rwandaise à partir de 96 ou de 96, ces crimes ont été très bien documentés au fur et à mesure que ces crimes se commettaient, à partir de 96-97 et ensuite les années qui ont suivi, hein, parce qu'il y a eu presque constamment des rébellions, des soi-disant rébellions et parfois des proxys pour des États de la région. On pense notamment à l'ADF qui n'est même pas au Grand Nord, qui n'est pas congolais, mais qui est d'origine ougandaise, et qui est, soit dit en passant, mais là je ne vais pas me répéter trop, qui est la conséquence évidemment de l'absence d'État empirique au Congo. Hein. Tout cela, toutes ces forces, tous ces groupes armés non étatiques, et toutes ces exploitations illégales de ressources, etc., tous ces phénomènes sont la conséquence de la déliquescence de l'État congolais. Et je trouve ça tellement important que je vais tout de même être tenté d'en dire un mot de plus. Je dirais que si l'on ne reconstruit pas l'État au Congo, le Congo ne se développera jamais et la région ne connaîtra jamais la stabilité. Donc toutes les actions tant des autorités congolaises et des acteurs congolais, y compris dans la société civile, les églises, etc., toutes les interventions qu'on fait au Congo, mais également, par exemple, dans le cadre de la coopération au développement, par des partenaires internationaux, ces actions ne peuvent, à mon sens, être faites que si elles contribuent de façon claire au développement d'un État au Congo. Les autres interventions qui ne font pas cela ne doivent pas être appuyées, me semble-t-il. Et le test, parce qu'il y a de nombreux tests, évidemment, le test droit de l'homme, le test environnement, etc., eh bien, au Congo, je dirais, le test reconstruction étatique. Donc voilà, je dis ça parce que c'est, pour moi, le début de tout. Et je ne vois pas aujourd'hui comment dire, de la direction des événements depuis l'avènement de Mobutu, ou certainement depuis les années 70, les années 70, ne sont pas allés dans la direction de la reconstruction de l'État, qui au contraire a été complètement déshabillé. Je viens sur la question des droits humains et du Holocauste. Les violations des droits humains, y compris possiblement, je dis bien possiblement, ça devrait être établi par une juridiction internationale ou nationale même, dont certains donc, je dirais, constituent peut-être un génocide, ont été extrêmement bien documentés à travers de nombreux rapports, et en particulier un rapport que tout le monde connaît bien, c'est le fameux rapport mapping de 2010 du Commissariat général des Nations Unies pour les droits de l'homme. Ça fait 25 ans, ça fait 15 ans, pardon, que ce rapport existe, et on n'a pas donné effet à ce rapport. Et il faudrait tout simplement, et je dis tout simplement, donner effet à ce rapport. Et là, j'appuie les appels nombreux faits par le docteur Mukwege, qui déjà lors de son discours à l'occasion de son prix Nobel de la paix à Oslo, a insisté beaucoup sur la mise en place d'une justice transitionnelle qui a été proposée notamment par le rapport mapping. Donc il faut, et je dis simplement parce que ça peut se faire demain. Les crimes en question ont été commis sur le territoire du Congo et en droit congolais et en droit de tous les autres pays du monde, les crimes commis sur le territoire du Congo sont du ressort des juridictions congolaises. Si les juridictions congolaises, et ça je le comprendrais, estiment ne pas être en mesure pour des raisons de capacité technique, même financière, d'assumer seule cette fonction, rien n'empêche la mise en place, proposée d'ailleurs par le rapport mapping et proposée par d'autres, rien n'empêche la mise en place de juridictions mixtes, où les juridictions congolaises seraient épaulées par une composante internationale, tant au niveau du ministère public, du parquet, de la poursuite en d'autres termes, et donc de toutes les enquêtes qui doivent encore avoir lieu. Le rapport mapping est un bon début, mais il fait 600 pages, il y a évidemment beaucoup plus d'informations dont on a besoin pour pouvoir efficacement poursuivre des suspects de crimes contre l'humanité, des crimes de guerre, voire de génocide. Cela ne se fait pas pour des raisons que je ne comprends pas. À un moment donné, le président Tshisekedi semblait vouloir s'engager sur cette voie, rien n'a été fait, et je ne comprends pas pourquoi demain, et si le président Tshisekedi écoute ceci, je profite pour le lui dire, de mettre en place tout de suite, ou de préparer en tout cas tout de suite la mise en place d'un mécanisme judiciaire de nature à juger les crimes qui ont été commis par le passé et qui continuent d'être commis. Et ce n'est que en faisant justice qu'on empêchera, je l'espère, qu'on empêchera la commission de ces crimes horribles à l'avenir. Si l'on ne poursuit pas les suspects qu'on connaît, et le rapport mapping cite un certain nombre de noms, il y a d'ailleurs des annexes du rapport mapping qui ne sont pas publics et qui sont extrêmement précis, me dit-on, parce que je ne les ai pas vus moi-même, mais notamment avec des suspects concrets, les actes qu'ils ont commis et ou qu'ils auraient parce que la présomption d'innocence est importante, mais qu'ils auraient commis, eh bien, tout cela devrait permettre à un bureau du procureur, qu'il soit congolais ou mixte, et par la suite des juridictions de fond, d'aborder ces crimes et d'empêcher, parce que si dans un pays, on peut faire un braquage de banque ou assassiner quelqu'un et qu'on n'est pas poursuivi, vous pensez bien qu'on va re-braquer une banque et re-assassiner quelqu'un. Ce n'est que parce que la justice existe qu'on peut empêcher, qu'on peut espérer empêcher la répétition d'actes pareils. Voilà, donc ça c'est ce que je voulais dire au sujet de la notion de génocide. Je pense qu'elle n'est pas utile. Je pense qu'il faut tout simplement faire ce que la justice d'un pays doit faire, c'est-à-dire aborder ce type de crimes. Rapidement, au sujet des Banyamulenge, vous savez, les Banyamulenge ont fait l'objet de victimisation au début de la Première Guerre. En 1996, je me rappelle que le gouverneur du Sud Kivu ordonnait quasiment l'expulsion des Banyamulenge, alors qu'ils sont congolais. Ils ont quitté le Rwanda, le sud-ouest du Rwanda, au courant du 19e siècle, avant la période coloniale. Et donc, d'après et ils ont fui, ce qui est intéressant, sont des Tutsi, soit dit en passant, qui ont fui le pouvoir dominé par les Tutsi de la cour royale rwandaise. Ils vivaient dans ce qui est le sud-ouest, qui était devenu plus tard la préfecture de Tchangougou, qu'ils ont quitté en réaction à l'arrivée de la cour royale Niginya rwandaise dans cette région, le Kinyaga, dans cette région, et donc ce sont des Tutsis qui ont fui d'autres Tutsis. C'est quand même assez intéressant de le constater lorsque on est obsédé par la notion des ethnies. Comme je l'ai dit, les Banyamulenge ont fait l'objet de victimisation, mais ils ont également fait l'objet de manipulation, et notamment par le régime rwandais. Et certains Banyamulenge l'ont très bien compris, et déjà en 97, certains porte-parole des Banyamulenge se sont opposés à cette instrumentalisation de leur sort par le régime rwandais qui a essayé de faire migrer les Banyamulenge des hauts plateaux au-dessus d'Uvira, Minembwe, vers le Rwanda. La plupart des Banyamulenge s'y sont opposés. Soit dit en passant, un certain nombre d'officiers Banyamulenge ont été intégrés dans l'armée congolaise et ils fonctionnent, même si récemment, et ça montre bien le caractère extrêmement délicat de la situation, même si récemment, comme vous le savez, un des officiers Banyamulenge a été un des officiers des FARDC, Munyamulenge, a été fortement contesté, ce qui a donné même lieu à des manifestations et des violences à Uvira. Je pense qu'il faut d'abord reconnaître les Congolais, les autres Congolais, parce que les Banyamulenge sont des Congolais, les autres Congolais doivent reconnaître que les Banyamulenge sont des Congolais. Et éviter de les présenter comme des étrangers alors qu'ils ne le sont pas. La même chose vaut d'ailleurs pour d'autres Banyarwanda, au Nord Kivu. De très nombreux, il y a évidemment des réfugiés qui sont arrivés de Tutsi après 59 et Hutu après 94, mais il y a de nombreux Hutus et Tutsi Banyarwanda, des Kinyarwandophones, au Nord Kivu et au Sud Kivu, hormis les Banyamulenge, qui sont des Congolais. Et c'est le devoir de l'État congolais de les reconnaître et de les protéger, et ce serait de la pure intelligence de la part de la classe politique congolaise locale qui vous tienne de respecter plutôt que de victimiser les rwandophones, parce qu'en fait les Banyamulenge sont également des rwandophones, même s'ils parlent un Kinyarwanda qui fait un peu rouiller, évidemment, parce qu'il s'est figé à la fin des années, à la fin du XVe siècle. Oui, le dernier point, la conflictualité à l'Est est une conflictualité qui est très complexe. Hein. Elle est la conséquence notamment je dirais, de l'intervention de l'armée rwandaise, incontestablement, et cela n'est pas récent. Hein. L'armée rwandaise intervient dans cette région depuis 30 ans, quasiment, hein, depuis 96, et a maintenu presque constamment une présence parfois très visible, parfois assez clandestine, ou par groupes rebelles, CNDP, M23 et autres interposés, même RCD ou AFDL au début de la guerre. Mais donc il y a également évidemment l'aspect des ressources naturelles, qui est incontestable, mais il y a, comme je l'ai dit et je le répète, surtout l'absence d'État. S'il y avait un État fonctionnel à l'est du Congo et ailleurs au Congo, hein, ce n'est pas seulement à l'est qu'on voit cette déliquescence de l'État, il n'y aurait pas 100, 200 groupes armés, il n'y aurait pas des activités des ADF au nord, il n'y aurait pas de confrontation souvent, pas constante, mais entre Hema et Lendu en Ituri. Il n'y aurait pas de victimisation des Banyamulenge, mais il n'y aurait pas non plus de... vous savez, l'État congolais n'est pas seulement absent dans des zones de conflit, même à Kinshasa, l'État congolais est relativement absent. Beaucoup de Kinois n'ont pas le moindre rapport réel avec l'État en tant qu'institution. Donc voilà, c'est là surtout qu'il faut, me semble-t-il, mettre l'accent, tout comme sur, je l'ai dit, sur la nécessité de justice.
Okay, thank you, Philip. We are running a bit out of time. We still officially have 5 minutes to go, so I will pull the 3 remaining questions on the chat, and then maybe you can formulate a brief answer. The first question is from Luc Henkenbrand. It's a question in French. It relates, of course, to the nature of the Rwandan regime, the authoritarian nature, their involvement in the violence in Congo, and the question itself, after this introduction where this violence is described, est-il normal que les championnats du monde de cyclisme se déroulent au Rwanda? Quelle est votre réponse? So maybe you try to reply in French as the question was posed in French. And then I have a question of Richard, who asks about the Batwa, who are ignored often, and so whether there are any specific actions or supports that could be taken to also advocate for Batwa development. And then I have a last question by Peter Verlinden. He asks about the quality of research done by Rwandans inside Rwanda. And so specifically historical, sociological, political research, maybe even. So those are the 3 remaining questions on your plate, Philippe.
Oui, je vais d'abord répondre à la question de Luc au sujet du championnat du monde cycliste au Rwanda. Bon, il y a aujourd'hui dans le Standard une tribune libre intéressante de notre collègue de l'Institut Christophe Kitika sur cette question. Donc je suggère que Luc lise cette tribune libre dans le Standard. Je pense qu'elle est très convaincante et elle résume bien la situation. Donc c'est un cas de... Mais le Rwanda n'est pas exceptionnel, c'est un cas de sportswashing, ce qu'on appelle sportswashing. Comme il y a du greenwashing lorsqu'on prétend que les choses sont plus vertes qu'elles le sont vraiment, ou plus écologiques qu'elles le sont vraiment. C'est une question de fric, hein. Le patron de l'UCI a de très bons rapports avec Kagame et voulait absolument organiser, c'est pour l'UCI, bon, c'est le premier championnat du monde en Afrique, dans un pays dont le président et beaucoup de Rwandais d'ailleurs sont très intéressés par le sport. Hein. si on m'avait demandé mon avis, je ne l'aurais pas fait, mais je n'aurais pas organisé le championnat du monde de foot à Qatar non plus, ou les Jeux olympiques d'hiver à Sochi. Donc voilà, c'est très simple. Est-ce qu'on prend les droits humains et la démocratie au sérieux, ou est-ce qu'on ne le fait pas? Manifestement, au niveau des sports, généralement, on ne le fait pas. Et d'ailleurs, ça rejoint des discussions qu'on a aujourd'hui en Belgique au sujet comment dire, de l'attitude que la Belgique doit adopter vis-à-vis du génocide qui se produit à Gaza, dans la bande de Gaza. Est-ce que on doit, en application de la Convention de 49 sur le génocide, est-ce qu'on doit effectivement combattre le génocide et par quels moyens est-ce qu'on le fait? Les sanctions semblent faire partie de ces moyens, mais ça donne, comme vous le savez, lieu à de très nombreux débats extrêmement délicats. Oui, Richard, c'était en français ou en anglais sur les battoirs?
That was in English, Philip.
Oh, in English, okay. Richard, I agree with you. I think I haven't mentioned the batwa. They are under 1% of the population, as you know. They are supposedly pygmoid, and they are indeed tend to be small. They're completely marginalized. They have been the victims of violence in Rwanda from 1959 onwards. And the reason why I haven't mentioned them, and they are never mentioned, is that politically speaking, they play no role. Rwanda is in ethnic terms, is a bipolar country. It's not a tripolar country. It's bipolar in the sense that only Hutu and Tutsi, politically speaking, play a role. And as we all know, bipolar ethnic situations are difficult to manage, much more difficult to manage than multipolar ethnic situations, as can be seen, or identity situations, as can be seen in countries like Belgium, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, and many others. So yes, you're right. And the Batwa, there's a small difference in Burundi. The Batwa are institutionally recognized. They have a guaranteed representation in parliament and in government. That's quite interesting. Although they are the same kind of marginalized minority as in Rwanda. But I agree, and I think you're right to draw our attention to the fate of the battle. The last question came from Peter Verlinden, and I'm trying to see what I wrote. History, research. It's an interesting question, Peter, because in the context of the decolonization of our political chronicles of the Great Lakes region, which we publish every year at IOB, I used to write the Rwanda entry of our political chronicles. Ugandans wrote Ugandan one, Burundians the Burundian one, Congolese the Congolese one. And in the context of decolonization, I've been looking for Rwandan authors to write the Rwanda entry, and I haven't found them inside Rwanda. We will now have Rwandan authors for the Rwanda entry in our chronicles, but they don't live and they don't work in Rwanda. And I see no, unfortunately, not the slightest critical view in terms of history, constitutional law, in terms of politics, coming from the University of Rwanda or other Rwandan universities. And this is, in a sense, understandable in light of what I said earlier. This is an extremely authoritarian regime which very tightly polices its own narrative. And the narrative that could deviate from the official narrative is considered dangerous, and those who formulate it run a considerable risk. That's why I quoted the quite strange passage in the history of Rwanda written under the auspices of the official National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, where the emergence of Hutu as an ethnic group, certainly by 1870, is explicitly acknowledged, which is actually contrary to the official narrative. I don't know what the consequence has been for the authors, or maybe and probably the Rwandan political elites haven't read the history of Rwanda written for NERC. It's 600 or 700 pages long. I've read it, and I think most people haven't. So I discovered a few interesting deviations from the official narrative in that document.
Okay, thank you, Filip. I think a lot of people will now go and check that document, and not because they doubt you, but it seems intriguing to spot like the disparities with the official narrative. So
that is interesting. If I may, Marijke, let me just to help your visitors to give you, because they can then Google it. You see. I'm looking for the reference. If you take NURC, National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, NURC History of Rwanda, and you Google that, you will hit the publication. Okay,
I put it in the chat. Thank you so much, Filip Reyntjens, for this interesting presentation, and I think also a very interesting Q&A. So I would like to also reach out to the participants of today to check our GLAC website, because the next presenter we have lined up is Mitch Still on the 30th of September, who will also present his book called The Police, the State, and the Congo Cop. That sounds relevant as well, since you talked about the state of Congo, Filip, and how its weakness, of course, invites to a large extent the conflicts that it struggles with. So thanks again to Filip and to everybody for presenting, and hope to see you in 2 weeks.